with us, and that's the real problem with it. What do they say it's all about? Well, various governments, they come up with different excuses, different reasons. So very commonly they say it's about the war on terror. Because, of course, the people who blew themselves up on the London Underground and in the Red Bus were from Afghanistan, weren't they? No, they weren't. They were from Beeston, they were from Leeds, they were from the edge of Bradford, they were from Dewsbury. And in fact, the British National Party had told the police in Dewsbury, about 5 years before that happened, about a group of young Muslims who were training in the woods on the edge of Dewsbury. We told them about it, and they and the local press laughed. They didn't even go to take statements, the police, off the farmer, or two farmers who told our people in Dewsbury about it. They weren't even interested. And for sure, that was that young gang when they started training and getting excited. And if they'd been stopped, if the police hadn't been so scared of a possible riot in Dewsbury, if they came in and slapped down a group of silly young Muslim extremists, if the police hadn't been so politically correct they didn't dare do anything about it, they'd have gone in, they'd have nicked those kids, they'd have broken that gang up, they'd have put them inside for a couple of months at most, and those kids and their 55 victims would still be alive today. But instead the British establishment turns a blind eye to Muslim extremism and Muslim terrorism where it really exists, namely in Britain. They turn a blind eye, effectively, to gangs of Muslim thugs beating young English lads half to death with hammers just down the road from here. They turn blind eyes to those things, and they say, unless we go over to Afghanistan, then those Afghan farmers are going to become terrorists. Well, they're not terrorists. They're Afghan farmers who, even if they are fighting our soldiers in the cowardly way that guerrilla armies have to do, planting roadside bombs and so on. Let's face it, they're fighting our soldiers because our soldiers are in their country, and they don't want infidel Kafirs telling them how to run their country any more than we want Muslim extremists coming here and telling us how to run ours. And they've got every right, the Afghan people, to say we want to run our own affairs. The fact we look at what they do and how they run their country, we look at the fact that if the Taliban were in power, or when they were, they insisted that women mustn't wear nail varnish. And they imposed that rule by, if they caught a young girl wearing nail varnish, they would pull her nails out with pliers. Absolutely barbaric, absolutely vile. But what the hell's it got to do with us? Why should a single British mother even worry about her son, let alone grieve for her son, in order to stop the Afghans putting the fingernails out of young girls? If the Afghans want to stop that, then let them stay in Afghanistan and fight for women's rights, fight for decent treatment for young girls and so on. Or if they want to do it, it's entirely up to them, and we haven't got the right to interfere. We wouldn't accept even a group of foreigners coming to this country who could run it better than we could. We wouldn't accept Britain being ruled, for instance, we don't accept it being ruled by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. As a matter of fact, they don't run it as well as we should run it, although God knows they couldn't do a worse job than Tony Blair and co. But nevertheless, even if they could do a better job, we wouldn't accept the right of unelected foreigners over whom we have no control coming in and telling us how to run our affairs. Why should we expect the Afghans to be any different? They're not different, they want to control their country, and, well, that's what they're doing. But certainly, the idea that Afghan terrorism will be directed against Britain is a nonsense. The people who blew themselves up in London were homegrown Islamic extremists who spoke with broad Yorkshire accents. The people who blew up the Twin Towers were Saudi Arabians, very wealthy, well-to-do Saudi Arabians. They weren't Afghan peasant farmers who'd blown up nobody except the invaders of their own country. You could say, well, what about the Taliban having training camps there before we went in? The whole country is now a training camp for terrorists. And they've got live targets, namely ill-equipped British soldiers, to use for their terrorist training activities. As in Iraq. Before we went into Iraq, there were no Islamic extremists in Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a horrible old socialist dictator who used to execute them. And they were trying to kill him. by going into Iraq, we turned the place into a howling wilderness of different terrorist gangs, all killing each other, and for that matter, training people to export terrorism around the world. But in the case of Afghanistan, that was never going on. So it's not about making the world safe and getting rid of terrorists. It's actually increased the terrorist problem. It's destabilising Pakistan. And if they think they've got a problem with Afghanistan, wait until Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, becomes an Islamic republic. Wait until Pakistan starts actively exporting terrorism, when every significant town in Britain has a significant Pakistani community whose second and third generation youngsters are more radical and more anti-us than the first ones who came over here. So, yeah, the war over there has something to do with terrorism. Damn right it has. It's creating terrorism. It's making things worse. So when that one fails, they come out with the idea, well, it's about democracy. It's about human rights. And every now and again they say, yeah, our soldiers have to be over there in order to provide free and fair elections for the Afghan people. Did they tell us that when they first sent them? No. Would anyone in Britain accept that? Is that what British soldiers sign on the line? As far as I know, they sign on the line and they swear allegiance to the Queen of our country, and they sign up to protect this country and our democratic rights and our freedom, which they did in the Second World War, which they did in the First World War, as far as we had democratic rights in the First World War, because many of the youngsters fighting in the First World War certainly didn't have the vote. You didn't get the vote until the 1930s, even if you were a man in local elections in Britain, unless you owned property. So the First World War wasn't actually that much about democracy, but it was still about British freedom. But certainly the Second World War, and some other conflicts since, the Falklands War for instance, that was a war about preserving British freedom in a part of Britain, which is precisely what the Falkland Islands are. They're part of Britain, peopled exclusively by our people. That's an example of a just war, a war which is worth risking having young lads killed for, because that's what they signed up for in the first place, to protect British freedom and British democracy. But no one ever in the history of the British Army has signed a pledge, has made an oath to defend democracy, to create democracy in Afghanistan. What absolute nonsense. There's no democracy in China. It's a favoured trading partner. There's no democracy in Tibet. It's crushed under the Chinese jackboot, but the British government's not interested. It's a mere excuse when they say it's about democracy in Afghanistan. No, it certainly isn't. And like I said before, if it's about women's human rights, they say, oh, if we weren't in Afghanistan, the Taliban would make every Afghan woman wear the burqa. Well, I genuinely feel sorry for some of those very lovely looking little girls over there. You see them on the news. And obviously they pick ones who are particularly pretty and appealing and so on, to tug on our heartstrings. But you look at these kids and you think, what a shame that they're going to be denied an education. What a shame they're going to be encased head to foot in a big black sack. But what's it got to do with us? What's it got to do with British soldiers, with British mums, with British girlfriends, with British kids whose dad's over there? It's nothing at all to do with us. And it would at least have some semblance of decency if the British government said, we're fighting in Afghanistan to stop Afghan women having to wear the burqa, if they banned it in Swindon. Then it might be fair enough. But when they're happy to let it be worn in Swindon, why the hell should British soldiers be put at risk to stop it being worn somewhere in Afghanistan? It's a wicked nonsense. So what is it about? Why are they there? Well, quite simply, it's about geopolitics, it's about energy. It's not a war for oil. Iraq was a war partly about oil. Iran, in a couple of years' time, is going to be a war partly about oil. But in Afghanistan it's not. It's about gas, the next thing to oil. Because just north of Afghanistan is Tajikistan, which sits on an enormous amount of natural gas, vast amounts of natural gas. And at present the natural gas of Tajikistan comes to the west through Russia, and the people who control the United States of America have got a beef with Russia because Russia used to be a predictable country. In the hands of the communists, they had an understanding basically with the people running the United States, and they could get along to an extent. But Russia now is something different. Russia is run by an unpredictable, basically nationalist government. It's run by a government who, yes, they've got corruption and so on, but they regard part of their job as to run their country for the benefit of Russians. They've got a sensible, normal, decent government. And they seek to use gas as a way of ensuring that their country is respected in the world and tends to get its way. They just do what a government should do. They run their country for the benefit of their own people, not for the benefit of all the rest of the world. And part of looking after Russia means having a Russia which has got a foreign policy and which is prepared to use power to get its own way. So it's potentially prepared to use its control over the West gas to say, stop interfering in Russian affairs. So that when, for instance, George Soros and various multi-billionaires in the West started to get involved in the Ukraine and created what they called an Orange Revolution, a purely phony, pro-American capitalist, pro-bank, pro-big business, pro-New World Order revolution in the Ukraine to take it away from Russia. It's next to Russia. It's in Russia's sphere of influence historically. But they use this artificial Orange Revolution to try to tear it away and to attach it to Wall Street and Washington and to make it, in effect, in policy terms, part or under the control of the United States. And the Russians said, we're not having that, so they turned the gas off, thereby making life so difficult for the Orange Revolution government that it collapsed. So that is why the people who control the United States of America don't want Tajikistan's gas coming through Russia. So they want to build a gas pipeline. And it's called the Tapi pipeline, because it goes from Tajikistan through Afghanistan, through Pakistan to India and the Indian Ocean. So then it can go to the rest of the world as liquefied natural gas, to Japan, to America, all over. And it's about building that pipeline, because it's not so much about the money, although that will make a huge amount of money for the banks and the American and the Saudi Arabian oil companies who are behind this gas pipeline. It will make people very rich. It will make companies like Halliburton, big construction companies and so on, it will make them hugely rich. So it's partly about the money, but it's also about the power you get in a world which hasn't got enough energy. Whoever controls the pipes and the taps has a great amount of power. And that's what that war is about. And that's why our boys are right now dying in Helmand province, because the pipeline is scheduled to be built right through Helmand province. Now, if they told us that, perhaps it'd be fair enough. You could have a nationwide debate then. Right, what are we going to do? Are we going to be involved in this war that's creating terrorism, that's costing us 20 billion, which is sending our boys home every Tuesday, every Thursday in Wootton Bassett in boxes? Or shall we use the 20 billion quid instead to, say, insulate every home in Britain, so we use less gas, less power? Shall we use the £20 billion to build a couple of new nuclear power stations so that we can create more of our own energy? Shall we simply do a deal with the Russians whereby we say, frankly, what you do in the Ukraine is up to you. If you come and tell us what to do in the Isle of Wight, or if you come and interfere in Ireland or in France, we'd have concern about Russian influence being too close to Britain. But we don't have any concern, any interest at all in Ukraine. I actually think Ukraine should be an independent state. But really, that's up to the Ukrainians and the Russians. So surely we could do a sensible deal with the Russians. We'll stop trying to interfere in your backyard. In exchange, please sell us gas. Because they want to sell us gas, because if they don't sell us the gas, they can't buy food for their people. So there's a natural, sensible deal there that we could do with them. And I think if there was a nationwide debate about that, the British people would say, hell no, you're not sending our boys to Afghanistan so that the Americans and the Saudi Arabians can build a pipeline which is going to make them lots of money and make them lots of power through Afghanistan. So that's part of what it's about. There's also more, it's not just about the gas, it's also about geopolitics, it's about international power. And the people who have huge influence in the United States. And you're talking, I'm not talking in code here, people who've looked at the conspiracy theories might think I'm talking out the learned elders of Zion or some such nonsense. I am not. I am talking about a very strong Zionist influence over the United States government. If you look at the people who fund, the people who advise the Bushes and the Obamas, there is a Zionist bloc there which is very, very powerful, which wants to stand up for Israel, and good luck to them. I've got no problem with that at all. I have got a problem when they start using political clout in Western countries to invite